Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. Today I'm joined by Dr. Treena Burgess. She's from Murdoch University in Western Australia, and she also holds an adjunct position at the Forestry and Agricultural Biotechnology Institute at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. She's here to talk about eucalypts, which are woody plant species native to Australia, although they are now grown on plantations worldwide. And what makes them particularly interesting is that as they spread, they brought with them a host of co-evolved pathogens, and we can now use that history as a lens to view pathogen spread more generally. Let's get straight to the interview. Dr. Burgess, thank you for joining me today.
No problem. Thank you.
Dr. Burgess, I was hoping to get started, you could just give me a little bit of an idea of what eucalypts are and what characterizes these species.
Okay, so eucalypts, well, that's the genera. There are, I think, something like 800 species now, and they are predominantly found in Australia. There are 2 or 3 species found in the islands just north of Australia, but most of them are Australian species. And they are the dominant tree in the landscape in Australia. So they extend from the coolest areas, so they can grow in mountains, there are snow gums, to the driest areas where, you're only getting, rainfall occasionally. So they're incredibly well adapted to a dry climate. So they exhibit sclerophyll, so they've got very hard leaves, and they're just very well adapted to a dry climate. So they have a whole range of growth habits, but there are species that can grow particularly fast, and it's these species that have been exploited around the world for plantation forestry.
Okay, and these trees are used for things like construction, or is it more of a paper-making application?
Predominantly paper making. They can be grown for timber, but this tends to happen more directly out of the natural forest where they've grown more slowly. In general, they're used around the world for plantations for pulp. So they, in some places like in Brazil and China, they grow these on a 5-year rotation. Other places are up to 8 to 10 years, but usually a eucalyptus plantation rotation is about 10 years.
Roughly how much area exists as plantations of eucalypts?
Well, at the moment, it's well over 20 million hectares and rising. So there's areas with a lot. So I think Brazil has something like 6 million hectares, 5 to 6, and I think China is starting to go in a similar way. So there's really big areas around the world.
Are these plantations, placed in any particular areas, or are they just sort of spread worldwide?
Yeah, predominantly in the southern hemisphere, except obviously China is not in the southern hemisphere. And the other place where there are a lot of plantations are actually in Spain and Portugal. There are different species in different areas. So in the subtropical region, where most of them are grown, there's the species Eucalyptus grandis and Eucalyptus europhylla predominantly, and hybrids between them. And in the more temperate areas, it's species like Eucalyptus globulus, which grow really well in those areas.
Okay, and your article is focused on pathogens, and
yes.
I'm wondering, what sort of pathogens affect these species?
Well, there are all sorts of pathogens on eucalypts, just like any tree in any ecosystem, as you can imagine. But the ones that have probably had the biggest impact in plantations, so the ones that are best known, there are several leaf diseases caused by species in the Teratosphaeriaceae and Mycosphaeriaceae. And then there's a few canker pathogens that have had quite a big impact, and they're in the Cryphonectriaceae.
Okay, so you're speaking in your article about this natural arms race between eucalypts and their co-evolved pathogens, and what I'm kind of wondering is how does that fall out of whack when you've got these plantations that are in different areas?
Well, what we think happens is, if you take a natural ecosystem, for example, generally it's many age. So you'll have everything from seedlings germinating to large trees. So you have a very heterogeneous landscape. and it'll be multi-species. So you have a whole range of interactions, and most pathogens only affect or cause disease when at some age in the plant's life. So it might be a leaf pathogen of young leaves, or it might be a canker pathogen of old trees or something. But when you have a plantation, you plant a monoculture very similar to any agricultural ecosystem. And we think that this provides a huge selection pressure for the build-up of pathogens. So so the inoculum can build up, and so you get lots of inoculum pressure, but also we believe that it gives pathogens sort of a strong selection pressure to adapt to perhaps a new host.
So essentially what's happening is that you're getting stronger pathogens or more able pathogens when you have this sort of growth and age monoculture. That is actually a really good question. I think we can't answer that 100%. We can't say that they're stronger or better, but what we could say is that their inoculum builds up so that they cause more disease. So you've got a higher inoculum pressure. They may well become stronger and better. And in the case of host jumps, where you've got something moving from one species onto another species, that could involve some alteration to their, I don't know, biology, I guess, of the pathogen onto the new host, and that may have some genetic changes. But I don't think there's much evidence for them being stronger or better. Okay, and beyond that, are there any sort of general patterns that we see with pathogens in eucalypts?
Okay, so eucalypts are a really interesting example and probably unique in that they are in really large scale across Australia. So as I said before, every ecosystem in Australia almost has eucalypts in it and are usually dominant. And then they have been planted huge numbers around the world. So you've got these two very big populations of eucalypts. But we also have eucalypt plantation industry in Australia as well, which sort of started about 30 years ago. So we have a whole range of potential interactions between plantations and natural forests. So we have native plantations in Australia and native forest, obviously, and then we have exotic plantations overseas in different countries. And then interacting with those exotic plantations will be the forests, which we in the paper to differentiate between native plantations and native forests, we've called as endemic forest if it's not from Australia. And often in those forests there are lots of species, particularly in the southern hemisphere, in the genus or in the family Myrtaceae. And so they're actually quite closely related to eucalypts. So in the Myrtaceae, there is a lot of opportunities for host jumps out of endemic forests into exotic plantations.
So you have cases in which you have the pathogens that are traditionally co-evolved with eucalypts are jumping to native forests outside of Australia.
Yes.
And then you also have the phenomenon in which pathogens that are evolved to grow on forests outside of Australia are jumping to the eucalypts. Yes.
We've got examples of nearly every single sort of interaction. Yes.
And it's obviously there are a lot of permutations that kind of stem from that basic case. I'm wondering, what sort of effect do these pathogens typically have on, let's just take, for example, a plantation? Does it sort of affect the vigor of the trees slightly, or, does it wipe it out? What are we looking at there?
Oh, you will have examples of all sorts of interactions. So when a new pathogen gets introduced, particularly into exotic plantations, they often get wiped out. So because they're a lot of the exotic eucalypt plantation forestry is clonal. And so if a pathogen arrives and that clone has no resistance to that pathogen, the plantation will be wiped out. But most of the forestry companies in that scenario will have many clones available, and they will replant or they'll test against the new pathogen, and they respond to this very quickly. But there are also a whole bunch of pathogens that aren't major diseases. They're just hanging around, and then, they don't do so much. And of course, being a disease, there's also the climate interaction. So you may have years where you have a very big impact and years where the impact's not so big.
And I'd like to ask you about that effects of climate a little later on. But I'm wondering, so you've touched on this a little bit, but is this a case in which forestry practices are contributing to the problem?
Well, yes and no. So forestry is forestry. It's just a form of, long sort of agriculture, really, horticulture almost. So trees are being planted, and then by the effect of them being a monoculture, they attract diseases to them. But then I think the biggest issue in this whole thing is that there seems to have been, and all our studies on population genetics prove it more or less, is that the same genotypes of a pathogen are found in many countries that are very far apart, and that the only way they can have been moved around is probably on infected germplasm. So I think there is the case of people in the forestry industry moving germplasm around and the diseases with it.
So is this a case in which, diseases may be transmitted to native forests outside of Australia from the transmittal of this germplasm, and it may have large-scale effects on sort of native ecosystems?
Theoretically. At this point in time, there are no examples of any of the pathogens that have moved off eucalypts into native forest having any major impact. I mean, we have examples, and to be honest, hardly anyone's looked at this. There's been some work done in Uruguay and a little bit in South Africa where, pathogens that we know are from Australia, from eucalypts in Australia, and that can now be found in the natural environment. But at this point in time, they're not doing anything major. It's mainly been species in the Botrys variaceae, which are sort of like endophytes and, latent pathogens, and they're not having a big impact at this point in time.
But is there a threat that they would in the future at some point?
Oh, definitely, yes.
How would that work? What would be potentially one reason why we might see it in the future, but we're not yet seeing it?
Time for the pathogen to adapt to a new hosts. So when it's gone the other way around, so probably the most classic example of all is the Puccinia sidii, which is the Uclip Rust, which moved out off native Myrtaceae in South America onto eucalypts. And it probably moved in that direction because, as we've been saying, like the monoculture is a huge selection pressure. So it moved into the eucalypts, and it's caused, a lot of disease in the eucalypts, which has been solved by, selection and breeding. But so there's no reason why it won't go the other way. But I think, once again, there is more resilience in natural ecosystems because of the diversity within them. So it's probably just a matter of time. But if the natural ecosystems are under a lot of stress and pathogens moving into them, then you could expect to see some impact.
So I suspect then you have a larger problem in which on a monoculture tree plantation, if you have a particular pathogen, you can manage against it, whereas in a natural ecosystem, you could not.
No, not at all. So I don't know if you were aware, but so Puccinia sidii, it's a rust, and there are lots of strains of it. And I think 4 years ago, a strain of it has entered Australia. And this is Australia, which has very, very good border biosecurity. So, of course, that's of great concern anyway, and we still don't really know how it arrived. It has moved rapidly through the natural ecosystems in Eastern Australia, all up and down the seaboard. Interestingly, it is not the genotype that affects eucalypts. but affects a lot of other species in the Myrtaceae, and in some places it's basically wiping them out. Very similar to how Cryphonectria parasitica works in the US. So you'll still get chestnuts, but they're always small and they're constantly being attacked, so they can never grow very big. So this leaf disease is doing pretty much the same in Australia. So the plants keep on getting infected, so they can't really grow.
Okay, so it sounds like just sort of laying out the groundwork. You've got widespread dispersal of these pathogens going through germplasm being spread around the world for the purpose of tree plantation. You have a sort of a proven case study, at least, of an introduced pathogen of this general variety being successful in Australia. So you have a proof of concept. You know that this can happen, and it's plausible that over some period of time, one of these pathogens will establish itself in a way that's destructive to native ecosystems. You mentioned earlier that a stress on an ecosystem might make this type of thing more likely. What kind of stressors are we talking about there?
Well, I would say, given the types of pathogens that seem to move, so I'll take a little step back here. So eucalypts have obviously a whole range of pathogens, and there are their leaf pathogens, which seem to be really tightly co-evolved with eucalypts, and they tend to be staying on eucalypts at this point of time as they move around the world. There's no example of a eucalypt leaf pathogen from Australia moving on to another crop, or another tree species. But the pathogens that can affect bark and cause cankers and get into the wood, they don't seem to have the same specificity, and they are tending to be the ones that we're finding moving off eucalypts in other countries. And these are the types of pathogens that tend to express themselves when the trees are stressed. And the most common stress is, of course, drought stress. And so, we've got this whole, with the global climate change, we're getting, more longer and more extreme drought events all across the southern hemisphere. And I think that would be one of the biggest potential stresses that could see these diseases emerging.
So climate change is certainly an issue here. And could it also be affected by the presence of other pathogens, or I'm thinking now of things like ecosystems that have been damaged by various beetle species that are introduced or invasive in some forests?
Yeah, they all work together. When we were actually putting this paper together, we did consider also looking at the insects, but then it was getting way too long and way too complicated because, of course, there's actually a very similar story with the insects as there is with the pathogens, and there have been quite a few insects from Australia that have moved around the world on eucalypts and have the potential to move off eucalypts into natural ecosystems. And then there's also just the fact that when any ecosystem is stressed, a lot of its native pests and pathogens express themselves, and so yes, you could end up with a natural environment somewhere that is under stress just from its own pests and diseases, and then when you've got another exotic pest or disease coming in, it's going to have a big impact, one would imagine, or could have a big impact.
And now I'll ask you the question, which is undoubtedly unfair, but what would one do if the goal were to reduce the spread of these pathogens? Are there any steps that could conceivably be taken that might be of use in reducing that spread?
Well, so obviously nothing can be done about what's already happened, but pre-border quarantine is the only real solution. So in the end, it always comes down to something regulatory. And then if a government is going to regulate for something, actually following through and having the inspections and trying to stop the movement of, germplasm. because I think, it's really evident. So we've done some population genetic studies, particularly on the leaf diseases that are found all around the world. And there is a really clear relationship between how old the eucalypt plantation industry is and how diverse the introduced pathogen is. So the older the industry, the more genotypes of a pathogen that have been introduced through multiple introductions. So obviously it's not just something that's happening once, it's something that keeps on happening. So if the industry itself can often get around diseases by selecting resistant genotypes or tolerant genotypes, they still have the issue of introducing new genotypes. And of course, the more diversity that's introduced, the more chance that a pathogen has of moving into a natural ecosystem.
So you've got a problem in which, the forestry industry really doesn't have a strong motive, financial motive, to reduce this spread on their own.
No, it needs to be regulated. Definitely needs to be regulated. I mean, we've always thought that it's, you would think that it was in the industry's interest itself to not allow this to happen, but decisions don't always get made by the biologists within an organisation. They get made by the economists, and and often those decisions seem to be, misdirected, I could guess you could say. I mean, we have an example in Australia, and it's actually a really nice example, and we put it in the paper, of where there was a eucalypt plantation industry established in Western Australia. So Western Australia is separated from Eastern Australia by a desert that is something like 3,000 kilometres in length. So nothing moves from Eastern Australia to Western Australia without human assistance. It doesn't move naturally, and it hasn't for 50 million years. So the eucalypt species that was brought into Western Australia is Eucalyptus globulus, which is known as Tasmanian blue gum. And it was effectively an exotic species to Western Australia. And when it was first introduced, it had no pathogens on it. And then there was a couple, but not very major, that moved out of the native forest. But then there was this big growth and expansion in the industry. There was, it grew from really quickly from sort of 10,000 hectares to 300,000 hectares. And when this happened, they bought in a lot of nursery material from Eastern Australia in trucks. And even though there were visual inspections, they obviously had a lot of asymptomatic infections, and very quickly a whole lot of new diseases were introduced into Western Australia, which they could have kept out. Like, they didn't have to let them in. If they had if they'd just been slower and just waited until they could grow all the nursery material in Western Australia, they could have avoided it. But they wanted to grow.
And it sounds like, you have then a need for intrastate as well as international.
Well, we do have interstate quarantine, but it's all done on visual inspections. And so if nursery material is always a big problem. And this isn't just for eucalypts, this is globally, this is the whole plants for planting issue, is that if something's grown in a nursery, they'll have usually applied fungicides and other pesticides, which don't necessarily kill a pathogen, but they will suppress its symptoms. So you can be moving plants that don't look visually diseased, but the pathogen is there. Yeah. So this is a problem for all sorts of diseases around the world.
That sounds very bad. Is there any movement afoot to change that practice?
Okay, so this is a practice that is regulated on a country-by-country basis. So Australia has very tight regulations about the movement of living plants. They can't have any soil attached because obviously there's a whole lot of diseases that can come in soil. And they have to be grown. So the only living plants that come in are things like bulbs, and they are planted in one field which is inspected for any disease expression by the quarantine. The other thing that comes into Australia is tissue culture, which should be disease-free. I think New Zealand has very similar regulations, but I am not sure if there are regulations like that anywhere else in the world. I mean, I know in Europe you can order live plants over the internet and have them delivered by mail. So, we have been talking about this for years. Every time we go to a biosecurity meeting or any group of foresters or any people that love plants get together, we always talk about stopping the plants for planting trade, but nothing seems to be happening.
Okay, and one of the aspects of your article I was hoping we could talk about a little bit is its broad view. Obviously, pathogen outbreaks have been dealt with on isolated local levels, particularly by those who have an economic interest in it. But there hasn't really been this wholesale, holistic approach to understanding the entire problem all at once, has there?
Yes. So there was actually a paper in BioScience, I think it was in 2001, which Mike Wingfield wrote, where he was talking about the movement of pathogens with the eucalypts industry, and he presented a lot of hypotheses. And then we more or less worked on this for the next 15 years. So we've had, over the past 15 years, we've had, I think, maybe 8 PhD students and a couple of postdocs. And so this is sort of a review or a summary of all their work over all this year. So we're basically, after this point of time now, we can take that overview, we can look back and say, this is what we know now. And so, yes, it is the first time it's been put together.
One thing I wanted to ask, following on to what you were saying about this being a follow-up on the earlier BioScience article, which we will link to in the show notes. What's next for your research? We have the hypotheses, and we have then the examination of the next 15 years of results. Where do you go from here?
I think the next phase is to look into the native ecosystems in a little bit more detail, because we do, as I said, we've got a couple of examples where we know that there has been a movement of pathogens from the eucalypts into the natural ecosystem, but this hasn't been done in any, sort of concerted way. And I think that is really worth looking at in more detail, especially given that we don't know how they're going to react in the future. So I think that will be of interest. I think we've pretty much, we know a lot about the plantations themselves, and so I think that's where we'll focus next.
Great, and we'll certainly look forward to reading and hearing more in the future. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you very much, James.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal Bioscience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.